Just before dawn, Cloud awoke with a start. He tried to rise, but every bone and muscle in his body resisted his efforts. He rolled flat on his side and stretched and flexed his aching neck and legs. Yesterday's mad dash to escape the Mustangers had left him battered and hurting all over. When at last he managed to struggle to his feet, he teetered his way down to the stream. Standing in the middle of it, he drank deeply. He remained there a little while, for the ice-cold water gurgling around his legs cooled his strained and feverish tendons. Later, he satisfied his hunger on the deep green grass that grew everywhere. After that, he felt better and went to look for his mother and the rest of the herd. He backtracked along the way he had come for almost an hour, but found nothing. He continued to wander on until he came to a wide gorge that blocked his way. He stood on the ledge and whinnied as loudly as he could. It was a shrill, penetrating sound that lost itself somewhere in the depths of the canyons. There was no answer. In all his short life, Cloud had never been without companionship, and because he was a gregarious creature, this awful loneliness persistently gnawed at his insides and spurred him on in his search. He called again and again. At last he found a trail leading into the gorge and gingerly made his way downward. It was terribly hot at the bottom, where all the intensity of the midday sun was trapped and held by the blistering stone walls. Vultures circled in the sky off to his right. He turned in that direction. Any company would be welcome. As he drew close to where more of the huge birds were feeding, they hopped awkwardly out of his way, but none flew off. He stretched his neck down and sniffed at what they were eating, then jerked violently back when he recognized one of the colts from his herd. There was the smell of death everywhere. Another carcass lay near the first. Evidently the animals, in their efforts to escape, had leaped or fallen off the edge of the Aurora and died on the rocks below. Cloud wheeled and rushed out of there as quickly as he could. Scrambling back up along the trail, he reached the ledge at the top and made his way to where he had spent the night. This place was familiar. Here, somehow, he felt less lonely. He grazed all afternoon, but every so often he seemed suddenly to remember something. His head came up then, and he turned slowly to scan the horizon. His whinnying was softer now, more plaintive, expecting no answer. Shortly before sunset, the day began to darken. Black storm clouds formed and billowed above the young Mustang, blocking out the blue sky. Lightning leaped through them, and claps of thunder punctuated the still atmosphere. Then a wind came up. As it increased in velocity, the trees along the stream bent and moaned. Bits of branches and brush whipped crazily across the ground. Cloud bowed his head and moved slowly before the brewing storm. Then the rain came, driving horizontally like the wind. Constantly struck by all kinds of flying debris, he drifted southward for several miles. Water was rushing everywhere, eroding the earth beneath his hooves even as he stepped on it. Finally, Cloud found higher ground and climbed upward. Now he was being pelted unmercifully by hailstones. Ahead of him loomed a wall of rock, but beneath an overhanging shelf he could make out a dark cavern. No water could reach him here. It was high enough and wide enough to accommodate him, but once inside the entrance, he instinctively turned to face the outside. A pebble rolled behind him, and in a flash he whirled about to face whatever danger threatened. At first, he couldn't see a thing, but as he peered into the blackness, he made out a shadowy something that strangely resembled the figure of a horse. Stiff-legged, he stepped forward, his nostrils dilated, searching. Friend or foe? He heard a soft nicker. It had to be a friend! The two young horses met nose to nose. Recognition was instantaneous. They rubbed shoulders and necks and made faces and mouthed each other, as horses will sometimes do when they meet. Everything about them seemed to be crying out how glad they were to see each other. Horses form extremely strong attachments, but with Cloud and the Bay, this devotion was even stronger and ran deeper than in most cases. Both animals had come from the same band, had romped together since they were foals. Both had somehow escaped the Mustangers and found each other when they really needed someone to hang on to. Early the following morning, the pair left their shelter. Cloud led off. The bright bay colt followed at his heels, happy to let the young gray take command. By noon, they reached Cloud's special valley and instantly fell to grazing. They kept at it for over 3 hours, but never once drifted more than 10 feet apart. Life was good. Occasionally they stopped to look and listen, but already the past was beginning to take its place in the scheme of things for them. Indian summer was settling over their valley. Color was beginning to show on the tops of the trees. Some were already shedding their leaves. The afternoon was hot for this time of year. Cloud was slowly picking his way up the side of a steep, rocky incline like a mountain goat. At the foot of the slope behind him, the bay was drinking from a tiny spring that gurgled up from the earth. The gray Mustang was searching for tufts of foliage that were still green here, unlike the burned-out vegetation of the valley floor. His velvet lips probed between the crags, catching everything edible, then snatching it up between strong teeth with the precision of grass clippers. So intent was he on his quest that he failed to notice the long, mottled shape stretched out before him. The rattlesnake was startled and struck with no warning. Cloud reared back, his muzzle whipped to one side, with 6 feet of diamondback latched to the end of it. The snake let go and went sailing off into space, turning end over end before it crashed to the rocks below. The sharp pain of the bite passed quickly, but the horse tried to get rid of the smart of it by frantically shaking his head and rubbing his nose in the dirt and against his knee. 1 hour later, his muzzle was out like a balloon. The swelling moved toward his eyes, and before long he could barely open them. He and the bay moved aimlessly across the valley. The other colt was not sure what had happened, but he did know the gray was in trouble. They stood together beneath an overhang of a ledge. The snake venom slowly spread through Cloud's body. Sweat broke out along his neck and flanks. Chills shook his frame so hard, his knees turned rubbery and threatened to collapse. This went on all night. Daybreak found him still on his feet, but terribly thirsty. He staggered to a nearby stream, but his swollen throat was unable to swallow any water. When the swelling and fever finally left Cloud 5 days later, the gray horse was hardly able to walk. He had grown thin from not eating. His flanks were drawn up and his hips protruded. The snakebite had drained his strength to such a degree that the effort of grazing and drinking tired him quickly, and he would lie down frequently to rest. When he did, the bay never left his side. The mornings were cooler now, and the nights became quite cold. This kind of weather stimulated the Mustang's circulation and his recovery from the snakebite. The young horses ate continuously, instinctively aware that soon the snow would fly and food would be scarce. They moved across the valley with their muzzles chomping away like a pair of lawnmowers. They found ice along the water's edge in the morning, and at night the bare trees trembled before a shivering wind. Again winter rushed in from the north, cracking a chill whip and dragging a bulky robe of white over everything. But their sheltered valley was a safe haven for the 2 young horses, somehow protected from the outside world. They lost considerable weight, but they were fit. They became a devoted team and warded off their enemies by standing close together, nose to nose, hindquarters facing outward to meet any attack. One icy moonlit night, 2 wolves spotted the pair digging for food along the stream. The predators were hungry and moved in to try to pull one animal down before the other had a chance to come to its aid. As the wolves charged, Cloud met them with a lightning-like kick of his hind legs that sent one wolf 20 feet up into the air, turning over and over and all spread out like a flying squirrel. When he hit the snow, he was still running in high gear, but in the opposite direction. His fellow conspirator, in the face of Cloud's flashing counterattack, speedily joined his companion to seek easier game elsewhere. The wind had shaped a high bank of snow in front of the cave where the 2 young Mustangs had met, concealing it cleverly against the cliff wall. When the weather really became inclement, the pair sought refuge here, where it was cozy and dry. They temporarily changed their eating habits to become browsers, chewing on whatever brush they could dig out of the drifts and the fine branches of the trees that hung low enough for them to reach. They had the company of many deer and elk. A pair of mountain lions culled the deer herd, and in February the few wolves in the area got their share too. March came and went uneventfully. Here in this valley there existed a true balance of nature without any outside interference. But one day, if Cloud had not interfered, he might have lost his companion. The gray Mustang was alone that afternoon, pawing through some brush and snow, when all at once a squeal of terror spooked him almost 3 feet off the ground. He came down stiff-legged as the bay came into view, floundering through a heavy drift of snow with a huge mountain lion draped across his back. The cougar was clawing for a grip on the Mustang's nose so that he could jerk his head around to break the animal's neck. The snow was too deep to give the frantic horse enough solid purchase to buck off his assailant, and it looked as if the big cat would make his kill. Cloud plunged to the rescue. He collided with the lion over the top of the bay horse. The momentum of his rush sent all three rolling along the ground in a swirl of white. The lion came out of it first, spitting with frustration. Cloud went after him with striking forefeet. His teeth clicked together like a steel trap, chopping off the hairs at the tip of the lion's tail. The cat went hightailing through the deep snow, yowling each time he heard the snap of the Mustang's jaws. The lion had been practically tasting his next meal, and here he was, only 5 seconds later, trying to get away from it as fast as his churning legs would allow. Cloud chased him clear across the white meadow. The cat finally took refuge on the lower branches of a blue spruce tree, where he lay for the remainder of the afternoon, nursing his ruffled pride. There were no more close calls for the two horses that month. In April, large patches of brown turf appeared on the slopes, which caught most of the sun's rays. A haze of green spread through the brown, which gradually deepened into new shoots of grass as the snow melted off. Then spring was suddenly upon them, and by the middle of May, the horses were sleek and sassy once more. All through the following summer, the local wildlife thrived. The two Mustangs had no more trouble with lions or wolves, but in early July of that year, something happened which altered their way of life. They were grazing along a narrow glen that reached up out of the valley floor and ended on top of a flat plateau. It was cool here, and the horses spent the middle of the day in the shade of the jack pines that had rooted themselves on the sloping sides of the ravine. Great boulders protruded from the earth, and numerous windfalls caused the horses to step slowly. Normally they would have smelled the bear, but the wind was strong. The lone grizzly was unaware of their approach, for he was intent on his meal of venison. The huge beast was making small whining sounds as he ripped into the red flesh of the doe which he had killed only a half hour ago. His great head came up when he heard a pebble roll. Blood dripped from the corners of his jaws. His tongue flicked out to lick them clean as his pig-like eyes focused on the pair of mustangs when they came into view. The bear had had a tough day. Making this kill had taken much patience and shortened his temper to hair-trigger readiness. The sight of the intruders jerked him to his feet with a snarl of rage. He came hurtling down the draw with such speed that Cloud and the Bay almost did not get out of his way in time. Because the horses shied in opposite directions, the charging bear braked to a halt for a split second, unable to decide which one to follow. Neither Mustang waited around long enough to find out. The grizzly rose to his hind legs. His wet black nose twitched as he tested the air. His temper cooled quickly, and he dropped to all fours again, and drank for a long time from a tiny trickle of water that wound its way down the gully. Evidently, he had eaten his fill, for he did not return to the slain doe. Instead, he ambled slowly up the side of the draw to seek out a soft, comfortable spot to sleep off his meal. The Mustangs did not stop running until they reached the valley floor. A good many horses would never have entered that glen again, but Cloud was a curious individual, and toward evening he ventured back into the ravine. The Bay followed reluctantly, but alertly, ready for an instant retreat. There, at the scene of the kill, stood a tiny fawn. The last rays of the sun had found their way into the gully and spotlighted the little creature in a golden shaft. The large, soft brown eyes were fastened on Cloud as he approached. She had been here since the bear left. When her mother failed to show up, she had ventured forth from hiding to find her. The smell of blood had confused the young deer, urging her to run away, but the scent of her mother held her to this place. The Mustang and the fawn sniffed noses. Who knows of the language between animals? But when Cloud turned away, the bewildered creature followed at a distance. Occasionally the horse stopped and waited. When he did, the fawn trotted forward. The Bay dropped in behind the fawn, and the trio walked slowly back to the valley floor. The baby had been nursing still, but circumstances weaned her in a hurry. She browsed like a deer, but mimicked the horses as they grazed. She had formed an instant attachment to Cloud and rarely left his side. In a way, she hampered the gray Mustang's freedom, but he seemed to take on his new responsibility happily. He kept an eye on the baby wherever she went, and always moved slowly enough for her to keep up. The Bay also accepted the new addition. When the Mustangs lay down to rest, the fawn curled up between them. She had nothing to fear from predators, for it would take a brave one to storm the fortification the horses provided for their charge. The summer passed, and when the snow blew into the valley once more, the young deer was more than half grown. Her spots had disappeared, and she was well on her way to maturity. Her reddish-brown summer color became a deep warm gray, with the brown showing through. Now she could keep up with the horses with not too much effort, using a peculiar running gait, a progression of stiff-legged steps, in which the feet came down together to the ground and then bounded off again like steel springs. Excuse me. The three spent a good winter together. Not once were they molested by predators. As spring crept in, the doe seemed restless, sometimes standing a short distance away from the mustangs, staring up the craggy slopes, as if she expected someone, as if she were listening for a sound neither horse could detect. Sometimes she wandered off at night, but always returned before daybreak. Once Cloud caught sight of 4 mule deer standing quietly on a high bluff, looking down at them. Then one morning, the doe did not return. Usually the mustangs ranged over their entire valley, but they stayed where they were for 3 days. On the 4th day, a group of deer appeared. Cloud trotted forward to investigate. The deer held their ground at first, but moved off as the gray mustang approached. Only one doe waited for him. The horse and the deer stood quietly together, nose to nose. Finally, she turned and bounded off to overtake her companions. Cloud watched them until they disappeared in a grove of cottonwood. He nickered softly, then swung back to the bay, standing behind him. The 2 mustangs were alone again. This year, Cloud's winter coat had shed out to a glistening, dappled pale steel color. His dark mane, forever in motion, hung to his shoulders, and his high arched tail could almost reach his forelegs when it swatted at the spring insects. His companion had become a shiny blood bay, lighter built than Cloud and nearly as beautiful. Cloud was still the instinctive leader, the bay a natural follower. Therefore, there were no conflicts in their personalities, and they were happy together in this land of plenty. But the outside world also had been changing. Men were no longer hunting wild horses only to ride. Now they were catching them to be sent to slaughterhouses, to be used for dog or cat food. But worst of all, their methods of capture had become modernized. Trucks were being used that rolled across the ground at high speed, much faster than any horse could run. There were also airplanes that dropped out of the sky to pursue the frantic animals from above. In their lovely valley, Cloud and the Bay had found a horse paradise, with no premonition of the invasion which had already begun.